Hi everyone, welcome back to the Brush by Brandy YouTube channel. This week we are actually working on part 2 of a certain furniture piece. And the reason this is a part 2 is because this particular piece is going home to be a bathroom vanity. And so for bathroom vanities, I tend to do poured resin tops. And so I need to do a resin pour on this one. But the resin pour in itself is such a process that I feel like it deserves its own video. So this video is going to be dedicated just to the resin pour. We're going to do a faux marble look. I'm going to incorporate some different colors, some gold and gray veining in a white marble look with some really pretty resin over the top of this piece. It's going to give it some waterproofing so that this piece can go on to be a bathroom vanity and they don't have to worry about water spills on the top and sitting on wood and damage to those sort of surfaces. So this is ideal for that purpose, but it's also just a really beautiful furniture finish and I think you guys are going to like it. So stick around and let's get pouring. To get ready for my resin pour, there's a lot of prep that goes into it. I started by gathering a bunch of Dixie cups, all my silicone stirring tools, of course my resin, all the resin dyes and colorants that I want to use, and I put them on a table that's been covered. I always start my resin work by working with gloves on my hands in a well-ventilated area because this can irritate skin and your lungs. I'm using Amazing Clear Cast Plus resin from Alumilite, and I chose this resin because it has UV protectants in it. All resins can have a tendency to amber over time, but with the UV protectants, it will help reduce that, and I need that especially because I plan on doing a white resin pour in this case. There is a calculator to tell you how much resin to mix depending on the surface area that you're trying to pour, so you can use that to decide how much you need to mix. I started out by mixing a full amount of resin and then I poured different amounts into some smaller Dixie cups, and I'm going to use these to mix up some colors. I'm using white resin dye also from Alumilite. In the Dixie cup I mixed it to a higher potency, and in the larger cup I'm mixing it to a lower potency. I like to have different variations in the shade of white. In my other cups, I chose a few colors of spray paint from Rust-Oleum, and I'm mixing those into a silver, a black, and a gold color. For these last three, I mixed very small quantities of them because I won't need very much. I'm just going to use these for some of the marbling in my resin. I started by priming the top of my dresser in a white primer, and now I'm going to pour my white dyed resin over the top of it. My entire dresser below has been wrapped in a plastic wrap, and then I added painter's tape under the lip, so anytime my resin drips over the edge of the dresser, it's going to drip onto the plastic. I also cover my floor using cardboard. I make sure I wear growth shoes, and of course I've got those gloves on my hands. Silicone tools will be easily washable. When I'm done with this, the resin will crack right off of them. This can be a very messy process, and so you want to put the time into the prep work and keeping your space as clean as possible. Before I'm doing a resin pour, I also will seal off my space. I work in my garage, and so I'll seal it off. Nobody goes in or out for the 24 hours before, and that way any dust will settle. Opening doors and driving cars in and out and things like that can cause the dust to stir back up, so everybody knows that we stay out of the garage during that 24 hours when I'm doing a resin pour. Once I've spread out that white coat of resin over the top of my primed base, I'm going to start streaking in some of my colors. And I do this by just drizzling that little Dixie cup over the top in sort of a random pattern. These are going to be the veins of my marble. I'm going to do this in those 3 small quantities that I mixed using the spray paint into the resin. And this was a light gray, a dark gray, or a charcoal color that looks like black, and then also a little bit of gold. You only need very little of these, and that's because a little bit of color goes a long way when you're mixing it into the light resin. I also want to point out that my primed base, I didn't have very full coverage. It was a little bit streaky, and that's okay because I want this to look like a natural stone. So any imperfections that it has in that base, they'll end up getting mostly covered, but I do like to have a little bit of variation in that coat also. Once I've drizzled those 3 colors into my white resin, I'm going to use a silicone basting brush and I'm just chopping at the resin over those colors. And this is going to allow it to sort of smear and smudge out those drizzled lines that I poured in and create sort of imperfections and smudgy lines instead. The resin will still self-level since it's a liquid, so doing it while the resin is still fresh is very important. You have about a 40-minute open time that you can work with this resin before it starts setting up and getting sticky. So I do need to move fairly quickly, which is another reason why I make sure my space is fully prepped and I have out everything that I'm going to need during the process. This coat of resin is called the color coat. This is where I go and have all the fun adding the colors and making the patterns that I want. There is going to be another coat that goes over the top of this, and that will come a little bit later. That's going to be the coat that perfects the surface and gives it that perfectly smooth glass-like finish. Different colorants and glitters can have different weights, so it can cause certain colors to sink below the surface of the resin. So that's something to keep in mind when you're doing all these colorants, that as you use them, they will tend to change places while the resin is actually curing. It does take about 24 hours for this resin to cure to the touch, and that's when I'll be able to come back and add that final coat over the top. Once I've chopped through all those colors, I'm going to come back, and the final little bit of resin that I mixed up was a more saturated version of the white, and I'm going to drizzle that through, and that's because true stone has multiple colors of white in it too. So this has a little bit more of the dye in it, and I'm just going to drizzle it through those colors. It's going to kind of camouflage them in some places, overlap them in others. It just helps it look more like a natural stone. Once I've drizzled that white through and I've chopped that as well, I'm just going to use a blowtorch, and I'm going to torch over this. This removes any bubbles from the surface of the resin. As I'm doing this, I want to make sure that I don't stay in any one spot for too long. You can burn your resin. I also make sure that I don't get too close to that plastic wrapping that's around the edges of my dresser. This is what the piece looks like with that resin coat, my first coat down. I need to walk away and let this one set up for about 24 hours. Once I leave this, I will come back after about an hour or two, and I'll just run my finger around the outer lip of the resin and just pull off any drips that have started to form. It's much easier to get them off when they're a little bit soft, but you don't want to let them dry all the way. And that will give me a nice smooth edge. Even though I've got that taped edge underneath, those drips can still form and be a little hard to get off. I've waited my 24 hours and I'm coming back for my next coat, but what I like to do first is I add a little bit of Weisel furniture salve. This is a hemp oil based conditioner that I add over my hands, and then I'll put my gloves on over the top of this. And what this does is if I get any resin onto my hands, it can be super sticky. Sometimes you get a hole in your glove and you don't realize it. And with that furniture salve on the top of my hands, I am able to wash them off easier. It just forms a barrier. The next step I'm going to do is wipe the top of my dresser using 90% isopropyl alcohol. And this is going to clean any smudges off the top that might have been places I touched it with my fingers, any oils that have settled, because those will be places that are resists for my final coat of resin. For this coat, I mix up slightly less resin, very slightly less than the first coat, and that's because this is just my final coat. I just need a thin layer over the top to perfect it, whereas that first coat I was doing all the colorants and things like that, so I tend to mix a little bit more so that I've got plenty of extra. So I'm going to mix equal parts of A and B of my Amazing Clear Cast Plus resin and stir them together in a cup for about 4 minutes. I make sure I mix this into a clean mixing cup because if it's got any residue or little chips of old resin in it at all, it will tend to go into your final coat and it can create a nightmare for you. So you really want to make sure all your tools are clean, especially when you're doing the second coat. The Amazing Clear Cast Plus resin, you want to make sure you get it thoroughly mixed when you're doing your stirring. So when I'm stirring with this stir stick, I pull up from the bottom, I will scrape the sides of my cup. You want to get anywhere that any of those parts could have settled and get them fully integrated into each other. I am using a measuring cup to measure these out so that when I pour them in, I have exactly equal parts. You do want to be pretty precise in your measurement when you're doing this. Now it's time for that really thorough stirring. I don't usually add any colorant to this coat. If I do, it might be just a little bit of mica powder for some shimmer, but usually this is a color-free coat. This is just a clear layer that's going over the top, so it's nice and perfect. I start by drizzling out over the surface, and then I set my cup down there at the end upside down so that it can let any drip out of the container, and I'll get all of the resin out of that. What I'm using to spread the resin over the top of the dresser is a silicone bowl scraper, and this is a great tool. I use these all the time. I use these for texture and different techniques on furniture as well, but they're great for resin. And then I let them dry. I let the resin dry on the tool, and I'll be able to flex it, and that resin will crack right off, and I can put that into the trash. I start out by spreading my thin layer over the entire surface, and I'm not flooding it over the edges just yet. That's going to be the last step that I do once I get the entire top covered and an even coat that I don't have any spots that I missed. I'm also looking for any place that there might be little specks of dust or anything that gets into my resin and picking it out while this is nice and wet. Once I've got a pretty good coat over the surface, I'm going to keep an eye on this and look for any spots, but the resin's going to continue to self-level. The liquid will spread itself out. Once I've got that coat on, I come over to the edges and I'm going to start to flood those, meaning I pull some of the resin out of the center of the dresser and I pull it out onto the edges. Once you do this, it's when it's going to start to want to drip over the edges, and so that's why I saved this part for last. I'm using that silicone basting brush again. I cleaned it off before my use on the last coat, and I'm just chopping it over the edges of the dresser to make sure I get full coverage on that edge molding. By doing this step last, flooding it over the edges, you also don't get so much wasted resin. If you do it when the resin is super fresh, it's more liquefied, it's going to have more of a tendency to drip. Letting it set up for just a few minutes gives it a chance to thicken, and then you're not going to get as much drip over the edges. That tends to be a waste of resin, and it also makes more of a mess down the front of my dresser onto that plastic and onto the cardboard underneath. So you actually want to do this after a few minutes when your resin has set up a little bit. You can see just in that little bit of time since I started flooding the edges that the surface of the top has started to smooth out, and I do have a few areas that I'm going to need to go back over and just make sure those get full coverage. To get the resin to flood those edges, I'm just pulling it out from the center of the dresser using that bowl scraper. On this coat, you also do need to move fairly quickly, so have all your stuff out and be prepared for this. Once I've got those edges flooded, I come back with my torch and I'm going to torch this coat again, also being careful that I don't leave my torch in one place for too long. I usually do a couple of torchings. I'll torch it and then wait about 10 minutes, come back and torch it again, and then I'm going to let this set for another 24 hours, and this coat looks gorgeous. You can tell by that light reflection in the top that I don't have a lot of bending in the light, which means I've got a really good coat. After another 24 hours, I come out to my garage and I can cut off all this plastic and the tape using a razor knife and make sure that my dresser underneath is good. At this point, I also clean off the edges of the underneath. Sometimes that does need some touch up with my paint. You can also do this before you have your painted finish over the top, if you prefer to do it that way as well. I just do a little bit of touch up after I pull all the tape and the plastic off. Here's the final piece. This is a maximalist style, so it's over the top with decoration, but this top is gorgeous, you guys. It came out perfectly. This is going to be a bathroom vanity, so it will have a hole cut in it for a sink, and then the plumbing will go down the center where those doors are. I hope you guys enjoyed this process. I did. I love how this piece turned out. You guys can find links for everything I use in the description for this post. You can find more Brushed by Brandy on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, and YouTube, and on my website at brushedbybrandy.com. Don't forget to click that subscribe button.